long before the flags of the United States fluttered over New England, before towns like Hartford or Boston became names in history books, the land was alive with a rhythm older than any colonial map. A rhythm of forests, rivers, and people whose stories stretched back generations. Among these peoples, the Pequot tribe stood as a force unmatched in southern Connecticut, ruling fertile river valleys, controlling critical trade routes, and commanding both respect and fear from neighboring tribes. Their villages were not mere settlements. They were thriving communities with fortified homes, sacred spaces, and a social structure that balanced leadership, tradition, and survival. Men trained from childhood to hunt, fight, and defend their families. Women cultivated food, taught their children, and maintained spiritual rituals that bound the community together. Life was demanding, yes, but it was ordered, meaningful, and deeply rooted in identity. Then came the English settlers, fragile, desperate, and determined to survive in a harsh and unfamiliar land. They brought with them tools, guns, and beliefs foreign to the forests they now inhabited. At first, interactions were tentative. Trade of furs for European goods, cautious agreements, and moments of fragile coexistence. But as settlements grew, as the colonists' hunger for land and control expanded, tension began to crack the surface. The English saw the Pequots not as neighbors, but as an obstacle, a powerful tribe standing between them and the fertile lands they believed were theirs by divine right. Meanwhile, the Pequots watched these newcomers with equal caution. Agreements were ignored, hunting grounds trespassed upon, and trade negotiations skewed unfairly. Fear began to rise on both sides, mutating slowly into anger, mistrust, and finally, open hostility. By the mid-1630s, the fragile tension exploded. The Pequot War began. A war unlike any the region had seen. Night attacks, ambushes, and the infamous Mystic Massacre of 1637 left hundreds of men, women, and children dead in burning villages. Survivors fled through dark forests, pursued relentlessly by English militias and native allies like the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes. Families were torn apart, children were captured, villages destroyed, and the Pequot political and social structure shattered. By the end of 1637, the Pequot Nation, once proud and dominant, was a shadow of itself. Their identity, their land, and their community lay in ruins, scattered across rivers, forests, and colonial settlements. And yet the English were not satisfied. Military victory alone could not secure permanence. They needed legal authority, recognition that the destruction of the Pequots was justified, that the land they now claimed was theirs by law, and that no future resistance could challenge their conquest. This was the seed of the Treaty of Hartford, signed in 1638. Unlike a conventional peace agreement, this treaty did not negotiate coexistence or reconciliation. It did not protect survivors or honor their humanity. Instead, it erased a people, outlawing the Pequot name, dividing survivors among other tribes or English households, and legally distributing ancestral lands to colonists and allied tribes. The treaty was law following war, ink following fire. It transformed battlefield victory into a permanent, enforceable erasure of identity. For the English colonies, the Hartford Treaty brought security, expansion, and trade control. For the Pequots, it brought something far darker: legal annihilation. Entire generations were stripped of heritage, language, and history. Families vanished into other tribes. Children lost their parents, and survivors lived as shadows of their former selves. The forests that had once echoed with their songs now bore witness only to whispers of what had been. And yet, even in the darkest hours, some seeds of survival remained hidden, unbroken, waiting for centuries to reclaim their name. The Treaty of Hartford was not simply a document. It was a turning point in human history, a story of fear, power, greed, and survival, written in blood and ink, one that forces us to ask, when law becomes a weapon, who survives and who is erased? By the early months of 1638, the forests and rivers of Connecticut had already borne witness to months of bloodshed, fear, and displacement. The Pequot War, which had erupted the year before, was not a simple clash of arms. It was a culmination of years of land disputes, trade rivalries, and cultural misunderstandings. The English settlers, now firmly entrenched in Hartford, New London, and Saybrook, understood that survival required more than occasional military victories. It demanded complete control over the land and the people who lived on it. Every Pequot village that had resisted was either destroyed or weakened, but pockets of survivors still remained, hiding in swamps, forests, and even among neighboring tribes. These survivors represented a constant reminder that without formal recognition of victory, the threat of resurgence, however small, could destabilize the fragile colonies. For the English, a treaty was not about peace in the usual sense. It was about solidifying conquest, legitimizing land seizure, and preventing any chance of Pequot return. The causes that led to this treaty were as much political as they were social and economic. Land was the most precious commodity. Fertile riverbanks and forested hunting grounds were essential for agriculture, trade, and settlement expansion. The English could not afford to leave these lands contested. Trade disputes with the Pequots further inflamed tensions. The tribe had long controlled lucrative fur trade routes, and their alliances with other native nations threatened the English monopoly. Small incidents, thefts, raids, and minor skirmishes quickly escalated into retaliatory violence. Every act of perceived betrayal deepened mistrust and hardened the resolve of the colonists to eliminate the Pequot threat entirely. On top of that, intertribal politics played a critical role. The English leveraged rivalries between the Pequots, Mohegans, and Narragansetts to create alliances that amplified the effectiveness of colonial attacks. What began as a defensive war slowly transformed into systematic eradication, a chilling campaign that blurred the lines between military necessity and sheer ambition. The need for a treaty became undeniable Once the initial waves of violence had done their work, the English colonies wanted permanent legal validation of the conquest, a way to declare that the Pequot Nation no longer existed, that their lands were rightfully colonial property, and that survivors could not reclaim their place. The Pequots, weakened and fragmented, were left with no bargaining power. Yet the very act of writing the treaty required a form of negotiation, however one-sided, to document and formalize the outcome. The colonists knew that history would remember the victors, and that a treaty would serve as the official record of their triumph, shielding them from any future scrutiny or accusations of excessive cruelty. Every clause, every phrase, was meticulously crafted to ensure that the Pequot people would vanish from the map, their identity erased, and their lands distributed to the very colonists who had destroyed their villages. Yet even amidst the legal formalities, the human cost was impossible to ignore. Survivors, children snatched from their families, women absorbed into English households, men taken as servants or sent to allied tribes, carried with them the trauma of witnessing their people's annihilation. The treaty, in essence, was an instrument of emotional and cultural violence, codifying what the military campaign had begun. It was a document that turned fear, grief, and despair into law, a chilling reminder that power could dictate not just the present, but the historical record itself. As the English scribes dipped quills in ink to sign the treaty, they were not merely concluding a war. They were authoring a narrative of dominance, one that would be cited for generations as evidence of control, legitimacy, and civilization prevailing over savagery. The need for the Treaty of Hartford also had a practical dimension. Without it, the colonies risked uprisings, revenge attacks, and diplomatic complications with other native tribes. By creating a legal framework for Pequot dispersal, the English secured both territorial gains and social stability. It was a blueprint for colonial expansion, a model for using force first, law second, and terror always as a backdrop. The treaty, therefore, was not just a resolution to the Pequot War. It was a lesson in strategic domination, a document that demonstrated how military might and legal authority could intertwine to erase a people while providing settlers with a sense of righteousness. Even as the ink dried on the treaty, the psychological and emotional ramifications rippled through both the surviving Pequots and the colonies themselves. The English, having witnessed the horrors of war and now formalized their victory, felt a combination of triumph and unease. The uneasy knowledge that power gained through destruction carried a weight beyond the battlefield. The Pequots, scattered and silenced, endured a loss that was not only physical but existential. Their communities, culture, and very name were now officially outlawed. The Treaty of Hartford, signed in 1638, was therefore far more than a peace agreement. It was a tool of erasure, a historical turning point, and a chilling testament to the consequences of unchecked ambition and human cruelty. As the English colonists prepared to formalize the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, they quickly realized that writing peace on paper would be far more complicated. than any victory in battle. The war had left the Pequot Nation in ruins, yet the survivors' very existence presented an unexpected problem. How could the English claim complete dominance while ensuring that lingering resistance or appeals from neighboring tribes did not destabilize their fragile settlements? Each clause in the treaty needed to anticipate rebellion, escape attempts, or intertribal disputes, because even a single defiant Pequot survivor could spark tension in an already precarious colonial environment. At the same time, the English leaders had to present an appearance of fairness and legality to satisfy settlers back in Massachusetts Bay Colony, whose support was crucial. This balance between absolute control and perceived legitimacy created tension not on the battlefield, but at the negotiation table. A pressure cooker of ambition, fear, and calculated diplomacy. The English faced immediate logistical challenges as well. The Pequot survivors were scattered, some hiding in forests, some absorbed into rival tribes, and some held under guard in English settlements. Establishing who had the authority to represent the tribe, who could sign on behalf of the survivors, and who had the right to their remaining lands, was no simple matter. The treaty had to account for every village destroyed, every household displaced, and every plot of land claimed by the English or allied tribes. Meanwhile, colonists had to navigate tensions among themselves. Hartford settlers, Massachusetts authorities, and allied Mohegan and Narragansett leaders all had competing interests. Each wanted the treaty to secure their portion of land, trade, and influence, while avoiding disputes that could ignite further conflict. The process required endless deliberation, careful wording, and at times, deception. Because presenting the treaty as mutually agreed upon masked the reality that the Pequots had no power, no leverage, and no real choice. The emotional weight of these negotiations was enormous. The survivors, stripped of homes, family members, and traditional ways of life, were confronted with terms that dictated where they could live, how they could be absorbed into other tribes, and the prohibition of their very tribal identity. Women and children faced separation from parents. Men were assigned to servitude or forcibly relocated, and the Pequot name, a symbol of pride and resilience, was legally forbidden. Every clause of the treaty carried both practical and psychological consequences, ensuring that the Pequots would not just lose land, but their social cohesion, their culture, and their future. For the English negotiators, drafting these conditions required a blend of cold calculation and moral rationalization. They believed they were enacting divine justice. Even the physical environment presented obstacles. Negotiations often took place in unsettled, makeshift colonial halls or neutral spaces along the riverbanks, where cold winds, rain, and the ever-present threat of attack from unassimilated Pequots or rival tribes added stress to every discussion. Documents had to be meticulously drafted by candlelight, with every word scrutinized for potential loopholes that could undermine the settlers' claims. At the same time, tensions within the Pequot survivors, grief, anger, and despair, made consensus impossible. Some advocated surrender to avoid further bloodshed, while others resisted with quiet defiance, refusing to consent to conditions that would erase their entire community. The treaty, therefore, became not just a legal instrument, but a battlefield of negotiation, where psychology, intimidation, and strategy were as critical as any musket or arrow. Finally, the resolution of these problems required ingenuity, ruthlessness, and careful orchestration. The English leaders devised a framework in which the Pequot's remaining people would be absorbed into allied tribes, effectively neutralizing any chance of reorganization, while the colonies formally claimed the lands and resources that had once belonged to the Pequot Nation. The treaty specified boundaries, redistributed land, and assigned oversight to English authorities, all designed to maintain the illusion of fairness while guaranteeing total colonial dominance. Yet beneath the legal language lay a darker reality. This was not peace negotiated between equals, but control imposed by victors, with every sentence serving to codify cultural and physical annihilation. The Pequot War may have ended in flames and blood, but the Treaty of Hartford ensured that even after the guns were silent, the consequences would echo for generations, a chilling testament to how law can enforce what war began. When the Treaty of Hartford was finally drafted and signed in 1638, it was a document that seemed, on paper, to promise resolution and stability, but beneath the inked lines lay a chilling blueprint for the erasure of a people. The treaty divided the surviving Pequots among the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes, ensuring that no group could regroup or re-establish its own community. Every clause served a dual purpose: to appear fair to colonial authorities and rival tribes, while simultaneously consolidating English control over the land and resources once under Pequot stewardship. The treaty explicitly prohibited the Pequots from using their own name, a stipulation that stripped away identity and legacy. Survivors, no matter how young or old, were to be absorbed, scattered, and monitored, making any revival of the Pequot Nation impossible. The land, once fertile and fiercely defended, was parceled out to English settlers and allied native tribes, solidifying both economic and territorial dominance. Beyond the allocation of land and people, the treaty imposed restrictions that reached into the very social and cultural fabric of the Pequots. Their traditional governance, leadership structures, and spiritual practices were effectively outlawed. Anyone caught attempting to revive communal practices or speaking in the Pequot language could face retaliation or forced relocation. It was a legal erasure as much as a territorial conquest, designed to ensure that the memory of the Pequots would fade from both land and history. For the English, this was more than law. It was a tool of psychological control, cementing victory and leaving survivors with little hope of recognition or return. Every paragraph in the treaty carried weight, each sentence crafted with foresight, calculating how future generations would remember or forget. The Pequots. The immediate effects were devastating and absolute. Families were torn apart. Children raised among rival tribes or colonial households. Women married into unfamiliar communities. and men assigned roles that left them powerless. Survivors became ghosts in the forests and settlements they once dominated, living with a constant reminder of what had been lost. Colonists, meanwhile, celebrated the acquisition of fertile lands, trade routes, and resources once controlled by the Pequots. The treaty provided a sense of legal security, turning military conquest into permanent ownership and transforming what was once war-torn chaos into structured colonial expansion. Yet, the emotional scars on both the survivors and the communities observing these events were profound. Fear, grief, and resentment lingered, setting the stage for tensions in the region for years to come. Even as settlers began to cultivate the newly acquired land and establish towns, whispers of injustice and horror spread quietly among both native and English communities. The Pequot's annihilation was a story that many preferred to silence, yet the psychological weight of these events could not be contained. The treaty had achieved its purpose. It formalized conquest and provided legitimacy, but it also left a haunting moral legacy. Colonists prospered, but at the cost of witnessing the collapse of a proud nation and the suffering of countless innocents. The Treaty of Hartford became both a symbol of triumph and a dark reminder that law could be wielded as a weapon, capable of shaping not just land ownership, but the very identity of a people. The narrative of immediate impact did not end with territorial claims. Survivors, stripped of autonomy, lived under constant surveillance and control, their movements, marriages, and alliances monitored by both English and Allied tribal authorities. Children grew up knowing that their history was being written by others, that their stories were not their own. Adults carried the weight of trauma, mourning not just the fallen, but the very erasure of a culture. Meanwhile, colonial administrators documented every parcel, every assignment, every redistribution of property, ensuring that future generations would inherit not only the land, but a sanitized version of history, one where the Pequots were gone, their presence reduced to footnotes or forgotten entirely. The treaty's effects rippled outward, influencing future interactions, land disputes, and policies toward other native nations. It was a precedent, victory on the battlefield, enforced on paper and legitimized for eternity. As decades passed, the Treaty of Hartford continued to shape the landscape of southern New England in ways few could have imagined. At the time of its signing, the Pequot people, scattered and absorbed into other tribes, lived for generations as shadows of their former nation, their culture suppressed and their name forbidden. English settlers, meanwhile, reaped the full benefits of the treaty. Fertile lands, once cultivated by the Pequots, became thriving farms, towns flourished, and trade networks expanded under colonial control. The immediate military victory had transformed into permanent social, economic, and cultural dominance, establishing a model of how legal instruments could enforce conquest and erase peoples from historical narratives. Yet, behind the prosperity lay a moral and emotional cost that would echo through the centuries. The stories of countless innocents lost, of families torn apart, of a nation rendered invisible by law. The treaty's long-term impact extended far beyond land redistribution. It set a precedent for how colonial authorities could combine military force with legal documentation to achieve total control, a pattern repeated in later treaties with other native nations. The Pequot's enforced dispersal created ripple effects in neighboring tribes, altering alliances, power dynamics, and trade throughout the region. Intergenerational trauma persisted among survivors as oral histories, grief, and the memory of destroyed communities shaped identity and cultural memory. By codifying the erasure of a people, the Treaty of Hartford became not just a peace agreement, but a tool of historical manipulation, ensuring that for centuries, the narrative of the war could be told from the perspective of the victors, leaving the victims' stories almost entirely hidden from official records. In modern times, historians, educators, and descendants of both settlers and native nations have examined the treaty as a cautionary tale of the misuse of power and law. Archaeological evidence, oral histories, and archival research have slowly pieced together the experiences of the Pequots, revealing the human cost behind what colonial records framed as orderly resolution. The treaty reminds us that peace on paper does not always equate to justice, and that legal authority can be wielded to enforce oppression as easily as it can maintain order. It demonstrates the profound consequences of ignoring the voices, rights, and humanity of marginalized communities, and highlights the ethical responsibilities that come with power and governance. The lessons from the Treaty of Hartford resonate beyond the 17th century. In today's world, where treaties, laws, and agreements continue to shape lives, the Hartford example warns us that unchecked ambition, greed, or political expediency can devastate communities if mechanisms for fairness, representation, and empathy are ignored. It underscores the importance of historical memory, to remember not only the victors, but also the silenced, the oppressed, and the erased. By studying this treaty, we gain insight into patterns of colonization, systemic displacement, and cultural erasure, learning how to recognize and challenge similar injustices in the present. Ultimately, the Treaty of Hartford is a story of contrasts, victory and loss, law and oppression, survival and erasure. While the English settlers solidified their control and expanded their influence, the Pequots endured, albeit in fragmented form, maintaining the core of their identity despite centuries of suppression. Today, Pequot descendants honor their ancestors' resilience, preserving cultural traditions, language, and memory, standing as living testament to survival against overwhelming odds. The treaty, once a symbol of absolute domination, now serves as a reminder that history is never fully lost, and that the voices of the silenced can, over time, rise again to demand recognition, justice, and respect. As viewers reflect on the Treaty of Hartford, it becomes clear that history is not merely a record of events, but a mirror of human choices, morality, and consequences. The treaty teaches us that legal authority without ethics can devastate entire communities, yet it also reminds us that resilience, memory, and storytelling can preserve truth even in the darkest moments. For those willing to study the past deeply, the Hartford Treaty is both a warning and a lesson, a call to honor humanity, protect justice, and never forget the lives that shaped history, even when history tried to erase them.